Good evening. This league I have been playing a lot of speed clearing, map smashing, mile-a-minute builds. Spark, Poet's Pen, and some magic finding have left me exhausted for map content, and wanting desperately to fight a boss or two. With that goal in mind, I began designing a build to shred the buffest of Guardians, and maybe steal a sword or two from Shaper. What I ended up with is not what I initially anticipated, but has been a hell of a lot of fun to play. In looking for inspiration for a build, I started combing through the list of Shaper and Elder affixes in search of interesting potential combinations, and came across this little suffix on Shaper rings. Regain up to 15 life for each enemy hit by your spells. I'd already made use of a similar effect on a Watcher's Eye jewel on my Spark build, and was well aware how powerful 30 life regained per hit could be. With up to 2 of these rings and said Watcher's Eye, 60 life regained per hit would become possible, which seemed frankly ridiculous. Many of the choices for the build then grew out of this starting point, supporting a playstyle inclined to hit things often and hard to make use of this recovery engine. The end result is a character with between 500,000 to a million Shaper DPS, depending on buff uptime, and the ability to almost instantly restore its entire 7,500 HP pool, even in some of the most dire of circumstances. Nothing this character does breaks any particular records, but it is very well rounded and thus can handle some rather nasty fights with ease. A word to the wise though, this build is not particularly beginner friendly, as it does rely heavily on very specific Shaper and Elder gear, which requires either PoE.trade savvy or the knowledge to self-craft effectively. I would not recommend this to anyone just starting out. If you would like a Shaper-capable build that is more beginner-oriented, try my Blight Trickster on for size. With that out of the way though, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's begin with our main skill, Firestorm. There were a few choices going into this build as to what I would end up using to shred my way through Rayclast, but I ultimately landed on Firestorm due to its high single-target potential and massive number of individual hits. These properties are both crucial, due to our recovery coming from life gained on hit, and our goal being to kill endgame bosses. Incinerate was initially an option, but sadly is just in too rough of a spot right now to be feasible. Ice Storm could work, but would leave us without a shield for block shenanigans. Blade Fall and Blade Vortex are both solid, but do require conversion for an Inquisitor to play nice with them, making it harder to fit them into the build, though not impossible. Feel free to try these out if you like. I, however, stuck with Firestorm. Our links are as such. For clear, Firestorm, Spell Cascade, Concentrated or Increased Area of Effect, Increased Critical Strikes, Spell Echo, and Immolate. Against single target, Firestorm, Chance to Ignite, Concentrated Effect, Increased Critical Strikes, Spell Echo, and Immolate. For clearing, I found Spell Cascade to be so good that I can afford to leave Concentrated Effect in and still have good enough coverage while being able to faster shred the occasional tanky rare from an Essence or an Abyss. If you'd prefer to use increased AoE, feel free. Just remember to swap it around for bosses. If you're on a 5-link, I'd suggest dropping Immolate from either of these setups. However, the build performs far better on 6 than 5 links. As I said, this character is not a cheap one to set up. For single target, Chance to Ignite ends up beating out Control Destruction because critting is so important for boss killing as an Inquisitor, and Control Destruction just has too much of an adverse effect to our crit chance when Diamond Flask is down. Moving quickly now to our other skills, Whirling Blades is used as our movement skill, supported by faster attacks and of course Fortify. Prioritize getting a 20/20 faster attacks as soon as possible, as Whirling Blades is how this build gets around at any sort of decent speed, given that it wears Calm's Roots and has no Quicksilver Flask equipped. The rest of this character's sockets are taken up with auras and cast 1 damage taken setups. I'll start with the cast 1 damage takens. There are 2 in the build, designed to keep you alive while clearing dangerous content. Ball Lightning linked to Blind ensures lots of hits in packs, meaning lots of life recovered. A Firestorm and a Tempest Shield buff our block chance and also hit often, so also contribute to recovery. Finally, Enfeeble is thrown in purely because it is the single best defensive buff in Path of Exile, basically. The setups would look like this: Cast on damage taken, Blind, Ball Lightning, and Enfeeble, and a castle damage taken linked to Firestorm and Tempest Shield. Finally, for auras, I am able to sustain casts indefinitely on a very low mana total due to my Watcher's Eye having a Clarity affix, which I of course run Clarity to activate. Arctic Armor is a great choice with how often Spell Echo leaves us stationary, and Vitality is used to activate the second half of my Watcher's Eye, which is crucial to the build functioning. Watcher's Eyes with the correct affixes can range from 50 Chaos to 5 Exalts, so keep an eye out for cheap ones. Calm's Roots means there's no more sockets to use, so let's move on to itemization. As I've mentioned a few times earlier in this build, this character is not a cheap one, and relies heavily on certain Shaper and Elder affixes on rare gear. Knowledge of how to set up tailored live searches on PoE Trade and how to self-craft gear as cheaply as possible is a must, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions on the topic. I'll try to be as informative as possible here, though, in order to preempt as many questions as possible. The most important items in the build are the core items of the recovery engine, the rings and the Watcher's Eye. For your Watcher's Eye, aim for the affix which gives life recovered on hit while affected by Vitality, and ideally, chance to recover mana on cast while affected by Clarity as well. If you can't get this exact combination, you certainly at least need the Vitality recovery half, and running a lower level Clarity to give you more breathing room mana-wise could help solve mana problems. Your ideal rings would look like this. Diamond bases with the all-important life gained on hit mod, life, and some amount of resistances or stats to help you fill out your stat and res requirements. However, if this proves too expensive to initially craft or purchase, settle for rings with a life gained mod and just some acceptable amount of life or resistance, compromising on the diamond base. Do keep in mind that spell damage can roll on Shaper-touched rings, as can Curse on hit with Assassin's Mark. These are both incredibly good rolls, but obviously will up the price of your purchase. The next most important piece of gear is going to be your shield. This build obviously has recovery on lockdown, but mitigation is important as well to being truly tanky, and here is where we obtain some of that. Your priority is a Shaper-touch shield with percentage of block chance applied to spells. This roll goes up to 50%. Aim for as high as you can get, as well as life, resists, and if your budget allows, another one of Shaper's amazing shield mods. Seriously, this guy just loves shields. Just look at some of these mods. I've gone for one with charge generation on block, but any of these mods can be stupidly good under the right circumstances. Alright, let's talk chest pieces next. And guess what? This one is Shaper-touched. I hope you're starting to see a theme. There are a few really good rolls we can get here, but the most relevant for me seem to be base crit for spells, which works so well with Inquisitor it seems almost cheating. I purchased one with 100-ish life, 2 resistance rolls, and base crit for 20 chaos. So these are cheap if you're willing to self-link. Plus, to level of active gems is also a good option for your Shaper roll, but these two rolls seem to be exclusive to one another. One of the few slots not taken up by a Shaper or Elder item is the boot slot, which makes use of Calm's Roots for an easy 200 flat life and stun and freeze immunity. This is great for a build that is heavily reliant on being able to continue to spam spells to stay alive. A slightly lower roll than Perfect gets cheap pretty fast, so prioritize Perfect boots after you've gotten all the other gear sorted. Your gloves should be Elder touched, since this allows for a 5% block roll in the glove slot, which synergizes beautifully with the Shaper Touch shield. Aim as well for life and resistances here. A pair with the block roll, life, and a solid 45 cold res cost me an Exalt, so they're not cheap, but very obtainable. The Amulet slot can be one of a few things. On my version of the build, I used an additional Curse Amulet with spell damage, life, res, and multi that I had from a previous character. However, were I to use something different, I would likely aim for a Shaper Amulet with percentage of block chance applied to spells, life, and resistances, in order to better defend myself against dangerous situations. If either of these options are out of your budget, prioritize life, resistances, crit multi, and spell damage, in that order, as well as any stat requirements you might need to meet. The build could end up light on dex, for instance. My helmet is Elder touched. with flat fire damage added to spells, as well as, regrettably, less duration. What you want here is the flat fire mod, life, and resistances. Less duration was the result of an unfortunate Exalt slam that my Twitch chat peer pressured me into. Don't look for that roll. The enchantment Firestorm Explosion Area of Effect is hands down your best choice, so go for that if possible. My belt is a rare Stygian Vise that does a lot of work filling out resistances, strength, and life. A Darkness Enthroned is also a solid choice, but I needed a bit more out of mine in terms of resistances and stats. If you're lucky enough to get a Elder Touched Vise, Chaos Resistance during Flask Effect is great for Keula runs, but rather niche. Speaking of Stygian Vises, that brings me to the jewels. There are 3 Abyssal Jewels in this build, each with 2% block chance if you've been damaged by a hit recently, in order to buff our shield, as high life as can be attained, and cast speed, crit multi, or both. Prioritize the rolls in that order. The weapon the build makes use of follows the theme of being Shaper and Elder Touched as well. A Shaper Touch dagger can roll either cast speed or percentage of elemental damage gained as extra chaos damage, both of which are incredibly strong. Aside from that, aim for high attack speed for Whirling Blades, spell damage, and crit chance for spells. Self-crafting with an Essence of Woe on a Shaper Touch base is how I obtained my dagger, for instance. Finally, Flasks. As I mentioned earlier, Whirling Blades is used for our main mobility method, so that means no Quicksilver is necessary. A Diamond Flask is, though, for reliable crits. As well as that, I use a Rumi's Concoction to reach about 65% block, an Adziri's Promise for damage, and a Sulfur, Basalt, or Stibnite Flask by preference. The last Flask slot has an instant life flask for situations where I don't have enemies to gain life from. That about covers it. Starting now with the Ascendency Tree, this build chooses Inquisitor purely due to its ability to do solid single-target DPS with little investment into anything but crit. Righteous Providence into Inevitable Judgment means that penetration is left waiting at the curb, while Instruments of Virtue is, well, just a pile of good stats. Sanctify and Augury of Penitence are both theoretically good options, but Augury just makes a lot more sense, since it helps with shredding bosses far more, while being extra mitigation in a build that already has recovery covered. The rest of the passive tree will look very much like many other Inquisitor trees, since there are only so many good crit nodes that are on the tree and we want to just about click them all. Notably, only one duration cluster is taken, which is a decision I am still ruminating on due to how well Firestorm scales off of duration. Due to the fact that crit is basically the only real vector to scaling our damage, we are able to easily pick up plenty of life nodes, which means with good rolls on gear, the build breaks 7k, even possibly 8k life rather reliably. A brief note on the Pantheon. I'd suggest fully upgrading both Solaris and Lunaris, and switching between them as necessary. Lunaris obviously is better for things like Shaper and Guardian, while Solaris makes Rippy maps all that much more of a joke. The 2 minor powers I switch between are Tukahama, which provides nice defensive benefits while casting, and Shikari, which just gives poison immunity for Guardian maps that roll poison on hit. Also, Help Alira. That should be everything. This build has been a blast to play, as well as put together, and I'm sure there's a few changes I'll be making here and there. A few frequently asked questions to round out the video before I head off. Why no Sybil's Paw? Sadly, this just does not compete very well with a Well-Whirled Dagger for single-target DPS at all, and the +8 life recovered on hit, while theoretically synergistic with the build, is paltry compared to the other sources of this effect in the game now. Basically, Sybil's Paw is now the worst version of the Sybil's Paw effect in the game. Can I do this build without this or that thing? Probably. But don't be surprised if it feels much worse. This character is very interconnected, with every piece mattering quite a bit, so leaving anything out will leave you open to ending up with a mess rather than a build. That said, please do experiment. I'm always happy to hear where people go using my builds as jumping off points. What can't this character do? Hologram Masters? Probably. I haven't tried. No regen maps and Alley Reflect. That's about it, though, and I've done some truly rippy stuff with this. Is this the end of the video? Yes.
The end is the beginning. It must be perfect.
For who? Father, it's me.
Everything short of perfection is irrelevant.
Buy me some time. To me, Exile, quickly! To me, Exile, quickly! Buy me some time!
My mana is spent.
To me, Exile, quickly!